Last week we looked at how Jesus disrupts the culture war. And the culture war is a phrase coined by James Davison Hunter. Actually coined it, I think, in the 80s and 90s to talk about, in some ways, the constant churn our country is in. And there are a lot of aspects to this churn, a lot of aspects to why the polarization happens the way it does, and we seem to feel, well, it's more polarized now than ever, and there are certainly good arguments for that, but we've been recognizing that Jesus, in fact, lived in a time of great polarization himself. And as we noted last week, the disciples were in many ways on different sides of that polarization. And in fact, they wanted something for Israel. And I think the clearest communication of what the disciples were looking for from Jesus is found in the beginning of the book of Acts. After the crucifixion, after the resurrection, they gather around Jesus and they ask, "Lord, are you at this time going to restore the kingdom to Israel?" What did they have in mind? Probably all of the kinds of things that they grew up with reading in the Old Testament. The stories of David, the stories of Solomon, the stories about how Israel was when it was great. I remember when Donald Trump used the phrase, "Make America Great Again," I thought, that's an awfully savvy campaign slogan, because most of us have some golden age in the past that we want to return to. Jesus was pretty adept at sort of sidestepping that issue. Now, I think the disciples' perspectives would be reframed at Pentecost, but this is what he says to them. "It is not for you to know the times or the dates the Father has set by his own authority, but you will receive power when the Holy Spirit comes on you, and you will be my witnesses in Jerusalem and in Judea and Samaria and to the ends of the earth." Now, we don't think of these terms very often, but the disciples were waiting for Jesus to conquer the world, and they probably imagined that Jesus' conquest would take maybe something of the shape of Alexander the Great, who conquered the world. And the truth is, Jesus did win the culture war. How? When? And through whom? And it wouldn't have the shape of the Zealots and the Essenes and the Pharisees and the aristocracy, as everyone was thinking when they were debating Jesus. A couple of centuries later, a man named Constantine had a vision when the Roman Empire was churning a great deal more than we do. It would seem like every 2 or 3 years they would have a new emperor, and that emperor usually would win the throne by the blood of the previous holder of the empire. And Constantine had a vision of Jesus, saying to conquer under his banner. Now, is this in alignment with what the disciples thought, or was it different? Now, for centuries, the Roman Catholic Church has, for various reasons, seen this as, well, here is Christ's conquering of the empire. Protestants would look at Constantine often with a little bit different light, because over time, the political power and the religious power would get more and more aligned. Now, actually, the process of that was quite complex, happened through a number of centuries, and that ambiguity reveals the fact that, well, did Jesus conquer sin and death on the cross? Yes. Did he do so at the resurrection? Yes. Something important happened with Constantine and continued to happen throughout history, slowly, partially, strangely, in fact. It's always sort of the wheat and the tares. A very interesting book by one of the better historians around today, Peter Brown, looks at late Roman antiquity, 350 to 550, and looks at how they spent their money. And looks quite closely on, why did Constantine do what he did? In many ways, he was a pagan. In many ways, he was looking for a God who would reign. In many ways, he was hoping Jesus would be that God, because the Romans were so awash in different gods, it was costly and unmanageable to try to appease all of them. So they needed one God to rule them all. And actually what happened was Constantine did very well conquer the empire, and the empire settled down, and in fact his son would gain the throne. And so to that degree it was a success. But again, what we see is that slowly, sometimes with fits and starts, Jesus did continue to conquer the empire through the ages from this point forward. Now, this probably would have been more recognizable to the disciples asking Jesus, now will you restore the kingdom to Israel? Because if you read the Old Testament carefully, you'll notice all of these dramatic visions about Israel lifted up and Israel coming to fruition and the nations coming in and worshiping at Jerusalem, and all of these incredible visions which the disciples understood quite literally as there would be a king, he would conquer with blood, everyone would come, and his reign would be eternal. They imagined that this would happen in the normal means, which was normal to their world. That, well, that's how you have a conquering empire. But what we see looking back in time is that Jesus, in fact, changes the definition of how to conquer. Now, we've been working our way through the Gospel of Luke. In chapter 4, we saw Jesus preaching in Nazareth. Afterwards, they see him. They think about putting him to death. Luke 5, Jesus calls Peter. And when he captures those fish, Peter says, "Away from me, I'm a sinful man." Luke 6, Jesus is Lord of the Sabbath. And that is something so shocking and so radical, many of the religious authorities wanted to pick up stones and stone him. The rest of chapter 6 is the Sermon on the Plain, which is a parallel to the Sermon on the Mount in many ways. And then we wind up in Luke chapter 7, where many of these issues about the Jews and the promise God's chosen people in the Holy Land and the Romans all get brought to a head. When Jesus had finished saying all of this, to the people who were listening, he entered Capernaum. That was sort of his base of operations in the northern Galilee. There, a centurion's servant, whom his master valued highly, was sick and about to die. Now, one of the things that you might note in different English translations is that part of the reason English translations represent doulos in Greek as servant is because, in all likelihood, if they would render it as slave, we would get a little jar. We would feel a little hiccup. What? A slave owner? Well, many wealthy and powerful people were slave owners. Nearly 40% of the Roman Empire was made up of slaves. This is part of the reason that the Romans lived in such fear of slave revolts, because there were just so many of them around. In fact, the Roman Empire only worked because of slavery. So who is the centurion? He's not a Jew. He is a Roman officer who commands 100 other Roman soldiers. What are those Roman soldiers doing in Capernaum? Well, Capernaum is a significant enough city that they have a base there, and they are there to make sure that taxes are paid and nobody plots to overthrow the Romans. And they distribute Roman soldiers throughout the provinces so that rebellions can't get a running start. That is the job of the centurion. That is why he is there. That is where he is located in the Judean culture war. And he has a slave who is highly valued. That slave may have been a Jew. We don't know. The Galilean region was quite diverse in terms of its population, but it very well may have been a Jew. People fell into slavery in one of two ways. Either because their city was in rebellion and lost the war, so all the men become slaves, or he fell into debt. Now, this centurion is an interesting person because on one hand, in terms of the Judean culture war, he should be a bad guy. He is an oppressor. He is a slave owner. And he is using slaves and oppression to continue his lifestyle, to continue to subjugate God's chosen people. But then the next verses are really rather interesting. The centurion heard of Jesus and sent some elders of the Jews to him, asking him to come and heal his servant. When they came to Jesus, they pleaded earnestly with him, Jesus, this man deserves to have you do this, because he loves our nation and has built our synagogue. Okay. So the centurion owns slaves, maintains Roman hegemony over God's chosen people, but also seems to have a heart for these people, and in fact contributed to the building of their local synagogue. And so the elders of the Jewish people go to him and then go to Jesus, pleading his case on his behalf. Here's the funny thing about a culture war. What we do is we usually label people and we put them in one column or the next. And it's easy to do if we don't know a lot about the people. And we don't know the people in particular. And in this case, we have a guy who should be a bad guy, but the people he is oppressing and the leaders of the people he's oppressing are going to bat for him because he has a slave that is ill and he cares for his slave and he would like Jesus to heal him. Now, perhaps if Jesus was a true abolitionist, he would say, I'm not going to heal anybody's slave for a stinking slave owner. Jesus doesn't say that. We would imagine that the Jewish authorities would say, aha, I hope his slave dies. They don't say that. There's a lot going on here that, for the most part, is blind to us because we're not seeing the political, social tensions around him. So Jesus went with them. Now, here's something that's important to think about. Why is it that when you go to the doctor's office and you have an appointment, if you are late to your appointment, the receptionist at the doctor's office will say, well, you're late, we'll have to see if you can come in. That's all about social status because you hurry to get there on time, and then what do? You wait for the doctor, because it's a very subtle thing in our hierarchies of relationship that you go to the people who are important and the people who are under you come to you. Jesus starts heading to the centurion's house. He was not far from the house when the centurion sent friends, not slaves, friends, to say to him, Lord, don't trouble yourself, for I do not deserve to have you come under my roof. This is a surprising thing, because what the centurion has just done in terms of the social pecking order is put himself under Jesus. That is why I do not even consider myself worthy. He is lowering himself even still, the centurion is, to come to you. In other words, normally the centurion would come to Jesus if Jesus is the superior and the centurion is the inferior. And now the centurion is saying, I don't think I should even gain entrance to you. But say the word, and my servant will be healed. For I myself am a man under authority, with soldiers under me. I tell this one go and he goes, and that one come and he comes. And as a Roman soldier, if he tells a soldier to go and that soldier does not go, if the rebellion is bad enough, that soldier could lose his life. They deal with authority that seriously. I say to my servants, do this, and he does it. When Jesus heard this, he was amazed at him. Now, this is a centurion. He's supposed to be on the bad list. He's supposed to be an evildoer. He's supposed to be an oppressor. He's supposed to be... Be careful with the cords, because that thing turns, and then Rick's shots are going to be all off. He's supposed to be a bad person. And Jesus stops, and he's turning to the crowd, following him. He said, because everybody's watching this, they all want to know what's going to happen. I have not found such great faith, even in Israel. Then the men who had been sent returned to the house and found the servant well. The centurion is not a Jew. The centurion owns slaves. The centurion, his day job is to continue the Roman occupation over God's people, to make sure that Roman taxes are collected and to make sure that no sedition or rebellion happens. And Jesus just says, Jesus has not found faith amongst all of God's chosen people who are going to synagogue and saying their prayers and giving their gifts and doing all of those things. I don't know why this story doesn't capture our imagination more than it does. Soon afterwards, Jesus went to a town called Nain. And his disciples and a large crowd went along with him, because people are following Jesus everywhere he goes because they want to see what's going to happen next. As he approached the town gate, a dead person was being carried out. Now, another thing hovering in the background of the centurion story is ceremonial cleanness, according to the Mosaic Code. The centurion understood, knowing the Jews as well as he did, that Jesus might become ceremonially unclean if he would enter the centurion's house. Jesus will become ceremonially unclean if he touches the dead person. As he approached the town gate, a dead person was being carried out, the only son of his mother. Lurking behind these two stories are stories from the Old Testament, stories from Elisha. Nain, holder of a Jewish slave girl, comes to Elisha to get cleansed from his leprosy, and he does. Jesus cures a centurion. Elisha and Elijah dealt with widows who had only sons who died and were brought back to life. Both of these stories are mirroring the prophets. The only son of his mother, and she was a widow. This son was this woman's only hope for a future. And a large crowd from the town was with them. So you have this large crowd of people following Jesus and a large crowd of people coming out from the town for a funeral. When Jesus saw her, he saw the funeral, he saw the bier, he saw the dead man. When Jesus saw her and understood what this meant for her, his heart went out to her, and he said, "Don't cry." Then he went up and touched the bier. Now notice, he doesn't touch the body. He doesn't make mud with his spittle and put it on the body or any kind of thing that people would associate with healing. Remember what just happened with the centurion? They were carrying him on it, And the bearer stood still, and he said, "Young man, I say to you, get up." The dead man sat up and began to talk. Wouldn't you love to know what he said? And Jesus gave him back to his mother. Read the book of 2 Kings, stories of Elisha. Read 1 Kings, stories of Elijah. Widows being restored. But centurions, they were all filled with awe and praised God. "A great prophet has come amongst us," they said. "God has come to help his people." This news about Jesus spread throughout Judea and the surrounding country. Now, these are amazing stories, and when I tell them, I try to color them in for you. Because many of us have read these stories, and the centurion, well, that's just a guy. And he has a servant, and we think about like Downton Abbey and people running around with, no. It's quite likely a slave. And the centurion is a slave owner. And the centurion is oppressor. And the centurion is an occupier. And Jesus says nothing about the institution of slavery. Does that mean Jesus is pro-slavery? I don't think so. But what is Jesus doing with all of these conflicts? What is he saying? What is he demonstrating? Now, one way to dismiss this is just to say, I don't believe any of the miracles. Okay. One kind centurion doesn't take away the fact that the Roman Empire and its occupation was oppressive. Rome lived its well-being at the expense of other nations. Rome corrupted the morals of tax collectors and prostitutes. Rome promoted a rival system to the Mosaic law corrupting God's people. That's what fueled the Judean culture war. It's lovely that Jesus intervened in this tragic situation for that widow at Nain. But how many other widows lost their sons? Wouldn't this son and his mother live to die again? How much other suffering, even just around Jesus, went without relief? Why didn't he banish suffering altogether like Thanos and his little snap? But Jesus did win the culture war. We're no longer fighting about those things. Slavery is banished, and in fact, slavery was banished a number of times throughout history. And if it comes up again, I think it will be banished again. And other forms of slavery are in fact addressed because of how Jesus changed history. I was listening to a podcast this week about Pompeii. And one of the things that happened when they uncovered Pompeii is they were just shocked by the abject sexuality of the entire culture. And they were shocked by the fact that when they began to recognize more and more of the Roman lifestyle, that 40% of the people were there as slaves because that's the only way the empire could run. And it was built on the back of slaves. Jesus changed all of that. But how? Slowly, patiently, over tens and hundreds and thousands of years. It all changed because of Jesus. The centurion exhibited startling faith. He says, I'm not worthy, and say the word. The words of Jesus and these stories have been reverberating through the centuries, and they continue, in fact, to change the world. And I would argue that both sides of the culture war are in many ways heirs of Jesus, because they are all addressing things that are left unaddressed. Jesus' words get inside of us. They colonize us. They have been slowly remaking the world for 2,000 years. The title of this book, that the famous Salvador Dali painting, the reason I use it on my slides is because the author of this book and the subject of this book are, in fact, a testimony to this migration, that this Secular author in the UK, when challenged by a Muslim, deconstruct your own faith, started doing the history to realize that if you look at Greek and if you look at Rome and you look at history since Jesus, Jesus has been changing the world through his people ever since that time. And we don't see it because we're used to the changes. But we could respond, but don't we suffer and die? Yes, we do. Why didn't Jesus' words dispel the death and suffering and wipe every tear? Well, I'll tell you something. Bring me today the number one challenge you have in your life, and if God were to grant me the power to dispel that challenge, maybe I'd be handing out $500 million lottery tickets. Maybe I'd be healing mental illness. Maybe I'd be doing one thing or another. I dare bet within a number of months you would come back to me with another problem. Because the really great problems of this world are not simply out there and caused by evildoers like Centurians. They are inside each of our hearts. And so to simply give someone more health or more time or more money or a better job never actually addresses what our deepest need is. And this is where Jesus takes us on. Say, well, why doesn't God dispel this? Camus probably had the best quote. Camus, an existentialist. Christ, the God-man, suffers too. Evil and death can no longer be entirely imputed to him, since he suffers and dies. The night on Golgotha is so important because the divinity ostensibly abandoned its traditional privilege and lived through to the end. Despair included the agony of death. But why should we be satisfied with half measures? Shouldn't we demand everything here and now? Again, if I could give you exactly what you called everything today, a year or two later, you'd come back to me because it wouldn't be enough. Is there some greater glory that God can work through suffering, not just by avoiding it? The cross of Christ seems to say exactly that. The book of Habakkuk says, "The righteous shall live by faith." We don't seek suffering, we seek restoration. We practice obedience. We seek forgiveness, but more importantly, we learn to practice forgiveness. Someone who demands to be forgiven is not an unusual thing. Someone who can forgive stops us, and we pay attention. We await the revelation of the Son of Man. What does that look like? It's in the story. It's in the meal. It's in life all around us. He practices it and accomplishes it in such a costly, powerful, personal way that the entire world since he lived has continued to be reworked. On the night he was betrayed, he took bread and he broke it. And he said, "This is my body, broken for you. Son of Man, Son of God, come to be our meal, our sacrifice." As often as you eat this, remember me. Then he took the cup. And he said, "This is a new covenant in my blood." For centuries before, unknowing animals would have their lives taken from them to make a temporary peace between God and humanity. But now, the final sacrifice, the final purchase of blood, the sacrifice that will end all blood sacrifice, has come. And unlike every animal, this one comes willingly, knowingly. The one who knew no sin became sin for us. Take, drink, remember, and believe that the blood of our Lord was given for the complete forgiveness of all our sin. Blessing next, or then song and then blessing?
Song then blessing.
Okay.